Callum Waverly sat in his sunlit kitchen, the soft hum of the coffee machine blending with the gentle rhythm of the morning. It was one of those rare weekends where everything felt perfectly aligned, peaceful and complete. Lydia, his 15-year-old daughter, was sprawled on the living room floor, meticulously sketching on her tablet. Her creativity always left him in awe. Every line she drew seemed like a piece of her soul poured onto the screen. Odette, his wife, moved gracefully around the kitchen, her voice light as she hummed an old tune. She was preparing breakfast, a blend of waffles and fresh fruit, something Lydia had requested the night before. Callum watched her, his heart swelling with gratitude. To him, Odette was not just his partner in life, but the pillar of his world. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight, and let out a contented sigh. "Smells amazing, Odette. Lydia's going to love this," he said, smiling warmly. Odette glanced at him with a playful smirk. "You mean you're going to love this? You've been sneaking bites of everything I make lately." Lydia's voice chimed in from the living room. "Caught in 4K, Dad?" Callum chuckled, shaking his head. "Guilty as charged. But hey, can you blame me? Your mom's cooking is practically 5-star. As laughter filled the room, Callum's mind drifted momentarily. He often found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. Their home in Austin wasn't just a house, it was a sanctuary they had built together. His business, Waverly Environmental Solutions, had grown steadily over the years, a testament to the countless late nights and unwavering commitment he and Odette shared. "Are you daydreaming again, Callum?" Odette's teasing tone pulled him back to the present. "Just counting my blessings," he replied, his voice softer now. She paused, a flicker of something unspoken crossing her face, but it was gone before Callum could read into it. "Well, count yourself lucky that breakfast is almost ready." Moments like this had always been sacred to Callum, yet lately he couldn't shake a faint undercurrent, an invisible thread pulling at the seams of their seemingly perfect life. It wasn't anything concrete, just a fleeting feeling that Odette seemed distracted at times. Still, he brushed it off, choosing instead to focus on the joy of the moment. As they sat down to eat, Lydia animatedly shared her latest school project, a series of comic strips about environmental superheroes. "Dad, you'd be proud of this one. It's inspired by the stuff you do at work," she exclaimed, holding up her tablet. Callum's chest swelled with pride. "Lydia, that's incredible. You're going to change the world one day, you know that?" Odette chimed in, her smile radiant but her eyes distant. "She gets that determination from you, Callum." The meal continued with lively chatter, but Callum couldn't help noticing how Odette's laughter didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a subtle thing, something only someone deeply connected to her would notice. He made a mental note to check in with her later, brushing it off as work stress or the demands of managing their business finances. As the morning waned, the family decided to spend the day outdoors. Lydia had begged to visit a nearby nature reserve, a favorite spot for sketching and hiking. Callum loaded the car while Odette packed snacks. They looked like the picture-perfect family, yet, as they drove away, Callum felt a fleeting pang of unease, like the calm before an approaching storm. "Everything's fine," he reassured himself silently, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "It's just my imagination." Little did he know the foundation of the life he cherished so deeply had already begun to crack beneath him. Callum Waverly sat at his desk, scrolling through spreadsheets and client emails as the afternoon sun bathed his home office in a warm glow. The faint sound of Lydia laughing with her friends outside brought a small smile to his face. Moments like these made the long hours worth it. Yet as he leaned back in his chair, a flicker of unease crept into his mind. A vague recollection of the past week that he couldn't quite shake. He closed the laptop and walked to the kitchen. Odette stood at the counter, meticulously slicing vegetables for dinner. She seemed preoccupied. Her movements were precise, almost mechanical, as though her thoughts were elsewhere. "Need a hand?" Callum asked, trying to sound casual. She glanced up, startled. "Oh, no, I'm good, just lost in thought." "Work stress?" he probed gently. "Something like that," she replied, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Callum frowned but said nothing. Odette had always been the cornerstone of their family, the one who kept everything running smoothly. Yet lately, there had been moments like this, little slips in her demeanor that felt off. He dismissed the thought, unwilling to let a fleeting feeling tarnish the sanctuary they'd built. Later that evening, as they sat down to dinner, Lydia launched into a lively recounting of her school day, her hands animated as she described a prank her friends had played on their math teacher. Callum chuckled, but his attention kept drifting to Odette. She was quiet, her fork idly pushing food around her plate. "You okay?" he asked softly. Odette blinked as if pulled from a faraway place. "What? Oh yeah, just tired, I guess." Lydia tilted her head, studying her mother. "You've been tired a lot lately, Mom. Are you getting enough sleep?" Odette forced a laugh. "I think I'm just overdue for a spa day, you know how it is." But Callum knew her well enough to sense the lie beneath her light-hearted tone. He decided not to press the issue, at least not in front of Lydia. That weekend, they attended a neighborhood barbecue. It was one of those events where everyone knew each other just well enough to exchange pleasantries, but not deep enough to share secrets. Callum mingled with the neighbors while keeping an eye on Lydia, who was engrossed in a game of volleyball with the other teens. As he turned to grab another drink, he noticed Odette and Galen standing off to the side, their heads bent close together in an intense conversation. It wasn't unusual for them to talk. They worked together after all. But something about their body language made his stomach churn. Odette's hand brushed Galen's arm lightly as she laughed at something he said. The gesture was brief, but it lingered in Callum's mind far longer than it should have. "Hey," he called out, forcing a smile as he approached them. "What's so funny over here?" Odette's smile froze for a fraction of a second before she turned to him. "Oh, just Galen reminiscing about the old days. You know how he loves to exaggerate." "Old days, huh?" Callum said, his tone light but his eyes searching. Galen clapped a hand on Callum's shoulder, his laugh a little too loud. "You wouldn't believe half the stories if I told you, brother." The rest of the evening passed uneventfully, but that brief moment planted a seed of doubt in Callum's mind. As they drove home, he replayed it over and over, scrutinizing every detail. "You've been quiet," Odette said, glancing at him from the passenger seat. "Just tired," he replied, echoing her earlier words. That night, as he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, Callum felt the first crack in the foundation of their life together. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a subtle shift he couldn't ignore. The house was quiet, wrapped in the stillness of late evening. Callum Waverly leaned back on the couch, the glow of the television flickering across his face. Lydia had gone to bed after insisting on reading just one more chapter of her favorite novel. Odette was in the kitchen, ostensibly finishing up some last-minute emails on her tablet. Callum stretched, exhaustion from the day settling into his bones. It had been a long week, meetings, client demands, and the lingering unease that had shadowed him since the barbecue. He tried to shake it off, focusing instead on the documentary playing on the screen. Then a faint vibration broke the silence. It wasn't his phone. It was Odette's. "Are you going to get that?" he called out. She hesitated for a moment, then stood abruptly, clutching her phone. "It's probably work. I'll take it upstairs." Callum watched her retreat, a peculiar tightness in her posture. The creak of the stairs followed her until the door to their bedroom clicked shut. He tried to turn his attention back to the television, but his mind was restless. Something about her reaction didn't sit right. Minutes ticked by. The muffled sound of her voice carried through the ceiling, faint but distinct. She was speaking softly, her tone measured, almost cautious. Callum's chest tightened. It wasn't uncommon for Odette to handle work calls at odd hours, but this felt different. There was a secrecy in her movements that left him uneasy. Pushing himself off the couch, he wandered toward the kitchen under the guise of getting water. As he poured a glass, his eyes drifted toward the stairs. The conversation above continued, sporadic pauses punctuating her words. Callum strained to pick up more, but the words were too muffled to make sense. Finally, curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, got the better of him. Quietly, he made his way up the stairs, careful to avoid the creaking third step. He stopped outside their bedroom door, his pulse quickening. Her voice was clearer now. "Can't risk it. Not right now." A long pause. "No, I'll handle it. Just don't call again tonight." The finality in her tone was chilling. Callum's hand hovered over the doorknob, a war raging within him. Should he confront her, demand to know who was on the other end of the line? Or should he wait, gather his thoughts, and approach the situation with more clarity? Before he could decide, the conversation ended. The soft click of the phone being set down was followed by footsteps. Callum hurried back downstairs, his heart pounding as he settled onto the couch, feigning indifference. When Odette appeared moments later, she seemed startled to see him still awake. "I thought you'd gone to bed," she said, her voice carefully even. "Just wrapping up the documentary," he replied, studying her face. She was composed, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a guardedness that hadn't been there before. "Who was that?" he asked casually, hoping to catch her off guard. "Just a client," she said too quickly. "They're expanding their project scope, so it's been a lot of back and forth." He nodded slowly, the weight of unspoken doubts pressing on his chest. "You work too hard." Odette smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's nothing I can't handle." She kissed him on the forehead and headed to the stairs. "Don't stay up too late." As her footsteps faded, Callum sat in silence, the tension in his chest unresolved. Something was wrong, he could feel it. That call, her demeanor, the carefully chosen words, it all pointed to a truth he wasn't ready to confront. For the first time, the home they had built together felt unfamiliar. The warmth that had once enveloped their lives seemed dimmed, replaced by shadows he couldn't yet define. Callum leaned forward, his head in his hands. "What's happening to us?" he whispered into the empty room. Callum Waverly's hands trembled as he sat at his office desk, staring at the glowing screen of his computer. He had opened it to check a routine client report, but his mind kept wandering back to Odette's mysterious phone call. Something about her tone, her urgency, refused to let him rest. A soft knock on the door pulled him from his thoughts. Lydia peeked her head in, her cheeks flushed. "Hey, Dad, you busy?" "Never too busy for you," he said, forcing a smile. She stepped in, holding a sketch pad covered with intricate designs. "Just wanted to show you this. It's for my art competition next week." Callum's chest swelled with pride as he admired her work. "Lydia, this is incredible. You're going to blow everyone away." "Thanks, Dad," she said, grinning before heading back to her room. As the door closed behind her, the weight of his doubts settled back on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. With a deep breath, he reached for the stack of invoices on his desk, mundane paperwork that might help distract him. But as he sifted through the pile, a particular receipt caught his eye. It was for a high-end hotel in downtown Austin, dated just 2 weeks ago. The name on the receipt wasn't his or Odette's, it was Galen's, and yet the payment had been made with the company credit card Odette managed. Callum's stomach dropped. He flipped the paper over, scanning it again to ensure he hadn't misread. Why would Galen be staying at such an expensive hotel? And why would Odette be the one covering the cost? He sat back in his chair, his thoughts racing. A part of him wanted to call Odette immediately, demand an explanation, but another part, deeper, quieter, urged him to wait. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. Something about the receipt, about her secrecy, felt deliberate. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Callum couldn't stop glancing at Odette. She was chatting with Lydia, her laughter light and carefree, but to him it felt rehearsed. He thought about the receipt tucked away in his desk drawer, burning a hole in his mind. "How was work today?" he asked suddenly, interrupting the flow of conversation. Odette hesitated for a fraction of a second before responding. "Same as always, meetings, emails, nothing exciting." "And Galen?" he pressed, his tone carefully neutral. "Did he have any meetings downtown recently?" Odette's fork paused midair. "Downtown? No, why?" "Just curious," Callum said casually, taking a sip of water to mask the tension building in his chest. She resumed eating, but he noticed her posture shift slightly, her shoulders stiffening. The rest of the meal passed in strained politeness, with Lydia oblivious to the undercurrent of unease between her parents. Later that night, as Odette showered, Callum returned to his office. He couldn't let it go. He needed answers. Logging into the company's financial portal, he began combing through transactions tied to the company card. The hotel charge wasn't the only anomaly. Over the past 6 months, there were similar payments, restaurants, gift shops, and other hotel stays, all under Galen's name but processed through accounts Odette oversaw. His pulse quickened as the pieces started to fall into place. It wasn't just a single suspicious expense. It was a pattern, a trail of breadcrumbs that pointed to something far more significant than he dared to imagine. The sound of the shower turning off snapped him out of his trance. Quickly, he closed the browser and shoved the receipts back into the drawer. His heart pounded as he moved toward the door, his mind a storm of questions and doubts. When Odette entered the bedroom, her hair damp and her expression serene, Callum felt a pang of longing for the life they'd shared before this shadow crept in. But now, that life felt like a fragile illusion, one he wasn't sure he could protect any longer. "Everything okay?" she asked, slipping into bed beside him. "Yeah," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just a lot on my mind." She reached over, squeezing his hand gently. "You work too hard, Callum. Get some rest." As she drifted off to sleep, Callum lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The first thread of their carefully woven life had unraveled, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend not to see it. Callum Waverly sat in the car, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he stared out at the empty parking lot. The soft glow of the hotel sign flickered in the distance, casting faint shadows across his windshield. He hadn't planned to end up here tonight, but the nagging feeling gnawing at him had finally won. Something had drawn him to this place, a need to confront the truth, no matter how much it hurt. It had been a week since he'd discovered the string of suspicious charges. A week of sleepless nights, guarded conversations, and countless moments where Odette's smile felt hollow, her laughter strained. He had replayed every interaction in his mind, searching for the subtle cracks in the foundation of their life together, and now those cracks felt like gaping chasms. He stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at his skin. The hotel was quiet, the kind of place where secrets came to hide. Callum's heart pounded as he approached the front desk, his resolve hardening with each step. "Can I help you?" the receptionist asked, her voice polite but disinterested. Callum forced a smile. "I'm here to check on a reservation. Callum Waverly." The woman tapped at her keyboard, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Mr. Waverly checked in earlier this evening. Room 214. Callum's chest tightened. He nodded, murmured a thank you, and turned toward the elevator. His footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each step heavier than the last. By the time he reached the second floor, his palms were slick with sweat. Outside room 214, he hesitated. The door felt like a barrier between his life as he knew it and the devastation waiting on the other side. He raised his hand to knock, but stopped short as voices filtered through the thin wood. "He's been asking questions," Odette's voice said, low but distinct. "Then we'll have to be more careful," Galen replied, his tone laced with irritation. "I told you this was risky." Callum's breath caught in his throat. His legs felt rooted to the spot, his body a mixture of ice and fire. He pressed closer to the door, straining to hear. "I didn't plan for this to go on so long," Odette said, her voice trembling slightly. "I never wanted to hurt him." "Then maybe you should have thought about that before," Galen snapped. "We can't change it now." The silence that followed was deafening. Callum stepped back, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. He wanted to burst through the door to demand answers, but something held him back. The raw emotion coursing through him made his hands shake, his vision blur. He needed to leave before he lost control. Back in the car, Callum gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He stared out at the hotel, his chest heaving as he struggled to contain the storm inside him. How could this have happened? How could Odette, his partner, his confidant, the mother of his child, betray him like this? And with Galen, of all people? The weight of it crushed him, threatening to consume every part of who he was. When he finally drove away, the road blurred before him, his thoughts racing faster than the car. He couldn't go home yet, not like this. He pulled into a deserted park, his hands trembling as he turned off the engine. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own ragged breaths. For the first time in years, Callum allowed himself to cry. The tears came in torrents, hot and unrelenting, as he released the pain that had been building for weeks. He thought of Lydia, of the home they had built together, and the life that now felt like a cruel illusion. By the time he returned home, the house was dark, save for a single light in the living room. Odette was asleep on the couch, her phone resting on the coffee table beside her. Callum stood in the doorway, watching her for a long moment. She looked peaceful, almost innocent, and for a fleeting second he wanted to believe it was all a misunderstanding. But he knew better. He turned away, heading upstairs to Lydia's room. Peeking inside, he found her fast asleep, her face serene under the soft glow of her nightlight. Callum felt a surge of resolve as he watched her. Whatever came next, he would protect her. She didn't deserve to be caught in the fallout of their lies. As he closed her door, he whispered to himself, "I'll figure this out. For her. For us." Callum Waverly sat alone in his car, the soft hum of the engine the only sound in the stillness of the night. The weight of what he had overheard at the hotel pressed on his chest, suffocating and relentless. For days he had replayed their words, every syllable cutting deeper into the fabric of his trust. He couldn't let it go. He needed answers. The thought of hiring a private investigator had crossed his mind almost immediately. It felt extreme, invasive even, but Callum was a man who valued the truth above all else. And now, his life seemed riddled with lies. His fingers hovered over the phone screen as he searched for a local investigator, his heart pounding with a mix of guilt and determination. He hesitated only briefly before pressing the call button. The voice on the other end was calm and professional. "This is Nash Investigations. How can I help you?" "My name is Callum," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I need to know if my wife is being unfaithful." The next morning, Callum met Nash at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of Austin. Nash was a no-nonsense man with a weathered face and eyes that seemed to see right through people. Callum laid out everything. The suspicious phone calls, the hotel receipts, the overheard conversation with Galen. "I'll take the case," Nash said simply, sliding a small notepad back into his pocket. "But you need to be prepared. This process isn't easy. The truth might hurt more than you're expecting." Callum nodded, his jaw tightening. "I just need to know." The following week was a blur of tension and anticipation. Nash kept him updated with terse messages. Surveillance in progress. No new activity yet. Following lead. Each notification sent Callum's heart racing. He barely slept, lying awake at night beside Odette, who seemed none the wiser. Her demeanor was unchanged, effortlessly calm, effortlessly deceptive. By the fourth day, Nash called with news. "We've got something. Can you meet me tomorrow morning?" Callum agreed, his stomach churning. When he arrived at Nash's office, the investigator handed him a folder thick with photographs and reports. Callum's hands trembled as he opened it. The images were undeniable. Odette and Galen entering the same hotel, their expressions wary but their actions unmistakably intimate. There were timestamps, receipts, and detailed logs. Each piece of evidence was like a hammer blow to his chest. "These are from the past 2 weeks," Nash explained, his tone neutral but not unkind. "But based on the pattern, this has been going on for a while." Callum's vision blurred as he stared at the photos. His mind raced through memories, moments he had dismissed as insignificant, but now took on a sinister clarity. The late nights, the distant smiles, the fleeting excuses, it all fit. "Do you need a minute?" Nash asked, breaking the silence. Callum shook his head, swallowing the lump in his throat. "No, I'm fine." But he wasn't fine. He was unraveling, every fiber of his being strained under the weight of betrayal. As he drove home, Callum felt a cold clarity settle over him. The pain was there, sharp and unrelenting, but it was accompanied by a fierce resolve. He couldn't confront Odette yet, not without a plan. Lydia's well-being was his priority, and he refused to let her be caught in the crossfire. That evening, Callum sat in his office, the folder hidden away in a locked drawer. He stared at the blank notepad before him, trying to piece together his next steps. Should he file for divorce, confront Galen first, or wait for Odette to slip up again? Each option felt like a landmine waiting to explode. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Lydia peeked in, her face curious. "Dad? You've been in here all day. Everything okay?" Callum forced a smile, motioning for her to come in. "Just work stuff, sweetheart." She sat on the edge of his desk, studying him with the same perceptiveness that always amazed him. "You look tired." "I'm okay," he lied, reaching out to squeeze her hand. "Just a lot on my plate." Lydia tilted her head, her eyes searching his. "Well, if you ever need to talk, I'm here." Her words nearly broke him, but he held it together. "Thanks, kiddo. That means a lot." As she left the room, Callum's resolve hardened. He wouldn't let Odette's betrayal destroy the bond he had with his daughter. He would protect Lydia from the storm brewing around them, no matter the cost. Callum Waverly sat at the edge of his bed, his hands clasped tightly together, knuckles white against his skin. The folder of evidence sat beside him, a silent weight pressing against his side. He glanced toward the hallway, where Lydia's laughter drifted faintly from her room. It was a sound he cherished, a symbol of the innocence he now feared would shatter. He took a deep breath and stood, the folder clutched in his hand. His heart pounded as he approached Lydia's room. The door was slightly ajar and he peeked inside. She was sprawled on her bed, headphones on, sketchpad in hand, completely absorbed in her work. For a moment he hesitated. Could he burden her with this truth? But she deserved to know. She deserved honesty, even if it came with pain. He knocked softly and Lydia looked up, pulling off her headphones. "Hey, Dad, what's up?" "Can we talk for a minute?" Callum asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Her brow furrowed slightly, sensing the seriousness in his tone. "Yeah, of course." She set aside her sketchpad and sat up, crossing her legs. "What's going on?" Callum entered, closing the door behind him. He placed the folder on her desk but didn't sit, pacing the room instead. "Lydia?" he began, struggling to find the words. "I need to talk to you about something important. It's not easy to say, and it's not easy to hear." Her expression shifted to concern, her gaze following him as he paced. "Dad, you're scaring me. Is everything okay?" He stopped, turning to face her. "No, everything's not okay." He exhaled deeply, running a hand through his hair. There's something going on with your mom." Lydia's eyes widened. "What do you mean? What's wrong with Mom?" Callum hesitated, then picked up the folder and handed it to her. "I've found some things I wish I hadn't." She took the folder, her hands trembling slightly as she opened it. The first photo stared back at her, a candid shot of Odette and Galen walking into a hotel together. Her breath hitched, and she flipped through the other images, her expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to hurt. "Dad!" Her voice broke, and she looked up at him, tears welling in her eyes. "Is this real?" Callum nodded, his own voice thick with emotion. "I wish it weren't, but it's real, Lydia." She stared at the photos again, her hands tightening around the edges of the folder. "Why? Why would she—" Her voice cracked and a tear slid down her cheek. Callum moved to sit beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. "I don't know, sweetheart. I don't have answers for why she did this, but I promise you this has nothing to do with you. None of this is your fault." Lydia wiped at her eyes angrily. "I hate her," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. "How could she do this to you? To us?" Callum's heart broke at the sight of her pain. "Lydia, listen to me. I know you're angry and you have every right to be, but hate, it only makes things harder. I don't want you to carry that weight. This is between your mom and me." "But it's not just about you and her," Lydia snapped, her voice rising. "It's about our family. She ruined everything." Callum pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly as she sobbed into his chest. "I know, Lydia. I know it feels that way right now. But we're going to get through this. I promise you we'll figure it out together." They sat there for a long time, the silence punctuated by her muffled cries. Callum stroked her hair gently, his own tears falling silently. When she finally pulled away, her face was red and blotchy, but there was a determination in her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice quieter but steadier. Callum sighed. "I don't know yet, but I'll protect you. Whatever happens, you come first." Lydia nodded, wiping her face with the sleeve of her sweatshirt. "Okay, but Dad, don't let her get away with this. Promise me." "I promise," Callum said, his voice firm. "We'll face this together." As he left her room that night, Callum felt a strange mix of heartbreak and relief. The truth was out, and while it had hurt Lydia deeply, it had also drawn them closer. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he wasn't alone in this fight. The air in Callum Waverly's office was heavy, almost suffocating. The faint hum of the desk lamp provided the only sound as he stared at the open folder before him. Every photograph, every receipt, every timestamp in that file was a dagger to his heart. A vivid, undeniable confirmation of what he had feared for weeks. Callum leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His mind raced, trying to process the enormity of it all. He had spent years building a life with Odette, trusting her implicitly. And now that foundation was crumbling beneath the weight of her betrayal. His phone buzzed on the desk, jolting him from his thoughts. It was Nash, the investigator. "Got more for you," Nash said without preamble. "Some new transactions showed up this morning. Looks like a weekend getaway, booked just 2 days ago." Callum's stomach churned. "Where?" "San Antonio, a small boutique hotel. Reservation is for this Saturday. Both Odette and Galen are listed as guests." The words hit Callum like a freight train. He had hoped, somewhere deep down, that there might be a reasonable explanation for the earlier evidence, that it was all some terrible misunderstanding. But this was irrefutable. "Thanks, Nash," Callum said, his voice tight. "Send me everything." He ended the call and stared at his phone for a long moment, his reflection ghostly in the dark screen. Every fiber of his being wanted to storm into the bedroom, confront Odette, demand answers. But he knew that wasn't the way. Not yet. Callum glanced at the clock. It was late, but he couldn't sleep, not with this burning inside him. Instead, he opened his laptop and began scouring through their shared financial accounts. His fingers moved mechanically, fueled by anger and determination. Every charge, every transaction was a potential thread leading to more lies. And then he found it. A series of payments to a private storage facility hidden among routine expenses. It wasn't much, just a monthly fee, but it stood out because Odette had never mentioned renting a storage unit. Callum's pulse quickened as he jotted down the address. The next day, while Odette was out running errands, Callum drove to the facility. The clerk barely glanced at him as he provided the unit number, claiming he had been asked to retrieve something for his wife. It was a weak lie, but the clerk didn't seem to care. Moments later, Callum was standing in front of the small metal door, the key cold in his hand. He hesitated. Opening this door felt like crossing a point of no return, but he had already come too far to turn back. The lock clicked and the door creaked open, revealing a neat but sparsely filled unit. Callum stepped inside, his eyes scanning the shelves and boxes. Most of it was unremarkable. Old books, household items. But then he saw it. A small locked box on the top shelf. Callum grabbed it, his hands shaking as he placed it on the ground. It took him a few minutes to pick the simple lock, but when the lid finally opened, his breath caught. Inside were stacks of letters, some crumpled as though they had been hastily stuffed away. He pulled one out, the familiar curve of Odette's handwriting making his stomach twist. The letter was addressed to Galen, and as Callum read the first few lines, his vision blurred with anger. "I think about you constantly," it began. "I don't know how much longer we can keep this secret, but I can't imagine my life without you." The letters detailed everything, their affair, their stolen moments, their plans to meet. It was all there in black and white, undeniable and excruciating. Callum dropped the letter, his chest heaving. He wanted to scream, to smash the box, to destroy every piece of evidence that confirmed what he now knew to be true. But instead he sat on the cold concrete floor, his head in his hands. This wasn't just about Odette and Galen anymore. It was about the life they had stolen from him, the family they had jeopardized, and the trust they had shattered beyond repair. When he finally stood, Callum gathered the letters and placed them back in the box. He locked it and carried it to his car, his mind already working through his next steps. He couldn't avoid the confrontation much longer, but when it came, he needed to be ready. He needed to be stronger than his anger, sharper than his pain. For Lydia, for himself. Callum Waverly sat at the dining table, the dim light from the overhead fixture casting long shadows across the room. Spread before him were the damning pieces of evidence. Photos, letters, receipts. Every shred of proof he'd painstakingly collected over the past few weeks. His chest tightened as he stared at them, his mind racing with the weight of what was to come. Lydia was upstairs, likely sketching or reading, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing below. For her sake, Callum knew he needed to approach this methodically. No outbursts, no chaos, just cold, hard truth. The family he had fought to build deserved better than a spectacle, but he also knew that confronting Odette and Galen wouldn't be enough. This needed to end on his terms, with no room for manipulation or denial. He picked up his phone and dialed Nash. "Nash Investigations," the familiar voice answered. "It's Callum," he said, his tone clipped. "I'm ready to move forward." There was a pause. "Are you sure about this?" "Yes," Callum replied firmly. "I need your help for one final step." Over the next hour, they worked out the details. Nash would handle logistics, ensuring that the confrontation was documented in case things escalated. Callum couldn't afford for Odette or Galen to twist the narrative later. The plan was simple but precise. Gather them both in one place, present the evidence, and make it clear there was no way out. When he hung up, Callum leaned back in his chair, exhaustion weighing him down. The anger that had fueled him for so long was now tempered by sadness, an ache that reached deeper than he'd thought possible. How had they come to this? How had the woman he once called his partner turned into a stranger? The next morning, Callum pulled Lydia aside as she was getting ready for school. "Sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something important," he began. She looked up, her brow furrowing. "What's wrong?" "I'm going to confront your mom today," he said, his voice steady. "I need you to be prepared. Things might get messy." Lydia's eyes widened, but she didn't flinch. Over the past few weeks, she had shown a resilience that Callum both admired and mourned. No child should have to carry this burden. "Do you want me to be there?" she asked softly. Callum shook his head. "No, I need you to stay out of it, at least for now. This is between me, your mom, and Galen, but after it's over, we'll talk. I promise." She nodded, her expression a mix of determination and sadness. "Okay, just don't let them get away with it, Dad." "I won't," he assured her. That evening, Callum set the plan in motion. He called Odette first, keeping his voice calm. "I need to talk to you. It's important. Can you come home early tonight?" There was a pause on the other end. "Sure. Is everything okay?" "It will be," he said simply, ending the call before she could press further. Next, he called Galen, masking his disdain. "Galen, I need your input on something work-related. Can you swing by the house tonight?" Galen hesitated. "Can it wait until tomorrow?" "No," Callum said firmly. "It's urgent." By the time they both arrived, Callum was seated in the living room, the folder of evidence on the coffee table before him. Odette walked in first, her face etched with confusion. Galen followed a few minutes later, his demeanor guarded. "What's this about?" Odette asked, glancing nervously between Callum and the folder. Callum gestured for them to sit. "We need to talk," he said, his voice cold but controlled. "And I want to make something very clear before we start. I know everything." Odette froze, her eyes darting to the folder. Galen's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. "I've spent weeks gathering proof," Callum continued, his gaze never wavering. "Proof of your lies, your betrayal, and tonight you're going to answer for it." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Callum leaned forward, opening the folder and sliding the first photo across the table. "You thought you could hide this from me?" he asked, his voice trembling with restrained fury. "You thought I wouldn't find out?" Odette's face drained of color while Galen looked away, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. Callum slammed the next piece of evidence onto the table, a letter, its damning words bold and undeniable. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice rising. But neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening. Callum Waverly stood in the center of the living room, his gaze fixed on Odette and Galen as they sat on the couch, a chasm of tension stretching between them. The evidence folder lay open on the coffee table, its damning contents spilled out like a cruel puzzle of betrayal. Odette's hands trembled in her lap, her face pale, while Galen sat rigid, his jaw clenched, eyes avoiding Callum's. "Start talking," Callum said, his voice low and steady, though the effort to hold back his anger was evident in the way his fists tightened at his sides. Odette opened her mouth but faltered, her eyes darting to Galen as though searching for guidance. "Callum, I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Try the truth," Callum snapped, his voice rising slightly. "For once, just tell me the truth." The room fell silent, the weight of his words pressing down on them. Galen shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. This isn't how I wanted you to find out," he muttered, finally meeting Callum's eyes. "Find out?" Callum repeated, incredulous. "So you were planning to tell me someday? What, after you destroyed everything?" "It's not that simple," Galen shot back, his tone defensive. Callum took a step closer, his anger simmering just below the surface. "Not that simple. You've been lying to me for months, years. You betrayed your own brother, Galen, and you." He turned to Odette, his voice cracking with emotion. "You destroyed our family." Odette's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she whispered. "It was a mistake, Callum. A horrible, awful mistake." Callum laughed bitterly. "A mistake? A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or misplacing your keys. This was deliberate, repeated. You don't accidentally carry on an affair for months." Odette broke into sobs, burying her face in her hands. Callum watched her for a moment, his chest tight with a mix of anger and sadness. He wanted to feel nothing for her, to let his rage wash away the years of love and trust they had shared. But the pain was too raw, too deep. "I trusted you," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I trusted both of you. And this is how you repay me?" Galen shifted forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Callum, listen. I know I messed up, okay, but we didn't mean to hurt you." "Didn't mean to hurt me?" Callum's voice cracked as his fury boiled over. "You didn't think of me at all. Or Lydia. What about her? What about the damage you've done to your niece, Galen? Does she mean nothing to you?" Galen flinched at the mention of Lydia, his face darkening with shame. Odette looked up, her tear-streaked face full of despair. "Please, Callum," she pleaded. "We can fix this. I can fix this. Just give me a chance." "Fix this?" Callum repeated, his voice laced with disbelief. "You think there's any way to fix what you've done? You've shattered my trust, my life, my family. How do you propose we fix that, Odette?" Her sobs deepened, but she didn't answer. Galen remained silent, his head bowed as though hoping to disappear into the couch. Callum shook his head, his disappointment cutting deeper than his anger. "I'm done," he said finally, his voice steady but cold. "I'm done with both of you. You've made your choices and now you'll live with the consequences." He turned to leave but paused at the doorway. "Oh, and Galen," he added, his tone sharp. "Don't bother coming to work on Monday. You're fired." Without waiting for a response, Callum walked out of the room, his steps firm but heavy. Upstairs, he found Lydia waiting for him, her face a mixture of worry and resolve. "Did you do it?" she asked softly. Callum nodded, pulling her into a tight hug. "It's over," he whispered. "It's all over." But even as he held her, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Callum Waverly sat in his office, the morning light streaming through the blinds, casting harsh lines across his desk. The aftermath of the confrontation with Odette and Galen lingered in his chest like a dull ache. But he didn't have the luxury to dwell on it. Today wasn't about pain. It was about action. He had spent the previous night poring over documents, scrutinizing every transaction, every email, every piece of evidence that tied Galen to his betrayal. Galen's involvement wasn't just personal, it extended into the business, and Callum was determined to cut him out completely. Picking up his phone, he dialed Angela Hall, his attorney. "Callum," Angela answered briskly. "What's the update?" "It's time," Callum said. His voice was firm, resolute. "I need to initiate the paperwork for Odette's removal from our accounts and for Galen's termination, and I want to file for divorce." Angela paused, her tone softening. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" "I don't have a choice," Callum replied. "They made theirs. Now I'm making mine. By noon, Angela had arrived at his office with a stack of legal documents. As they went over the details, Callum's focus never wavered. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of himself, a step toward rebuilding what they had destroyed. "There's one more thing," Angela said, sliding a separate folder toward him. "This is for Lydia, custody agreements. I know it's early, but it's better to have everything in place now." Callum stared at the papers, his heart heavy. Lydia had been his anchor through this storm, and the thought of her being caught in the crossfire made his stomach churn. "I'll do whatever it takes to make sure she's okay," he said quietly. "She deserves better than this." Angela nodded, her expression understanding. "And she has you. That's what matters most." That afternoon, Callum called a company-wide meeting. The air in the conference room was tense as employees filed in, their whispers hushed as they exchanged glances. When everyone had settled, Callum stood at the head of the table, his posture straight but his face grave. "I won't sugarcoat this," he began. "There have been recent developments that require immediate action. Effective today, Callum Waverly is no longer with the company." The room erupted in murmurs, but Callum raised a hand, silencing them. "I know this comes as a shock, but I want to assure you that this decision was necessary for the integrity of our business. Moving forward, Debbie Gleon will be taking over Galen's responsibilities." Debbie's eyes widened, but she quickly nodded, a mix of surprise and determination on her face. "Together," Callum continued, "we will move forward. We've built something incredible here, and I refuse to let anything or anyone jeopardize that." The meeting ended with a standing ovation, though Callum couldn't tell if it was out of support or relief. Either way, it was done. Later that evening, Callum returned home to find Lydia waiting for him in the kitchen, a plate of cookies in front of her. "You look tired," she said, offering him one. He took it with a small smile. "It's been a long day." "Did you do it?" she asked, her voice cautious. "Yes," he replied, sitting down across from her. "It's over. Galen's gone from the company. And I've started the divorce process." Lydia nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "Good. He doesn't deserve to be there. And Mom—" She trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. "I just don't get it, Dad. How could she do this?" Callum reached across the table, taking her hand in his. "I don't have an answer for that, Lydia. But what I do know is that none of this is your fault, and no matter what happens, we're going to get through this. Together." She nodded again, squeezing his hand. "I believe you." As the night wore on, Callum found himself sitting in the living room, staring at the stack of documents on the coffee table. The fight was far from over. There were still loose ends to tie up, conversations to have, and wounds to heal. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. He had faced the storm head-on, and while the road ahead was uncertain, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't backing down. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, spilling warmth across the hardwood floors of the Waverly home. It was quiet, save for the soft hum of life slowly returning to normal. Callum Waverly stood in the kitchen, a mug of coffee in his hand, staring out at the backyard where Lydia sat on the porch swing. She was sketching, her pencil moving in fluid strokes across the page. She had always been talented, but lately her work had taken on a rawness, a vulnerability that spoke volumes about the storm they had weathered together. Callum watched her for a moment longer before stepping outside. "What are you working on, kiddo?" he asked, settling onto the swing beside her. She glanced up, offering him a small smile. "It's a concept for my art class. They wanted us to capture resilience." He raised an eyebrow, leaning over to look at her drawing. It was a phoenix, its wings spread wide, rising from a bed of flames. The detail was stunning, every feather alive with energy and hope. "It's beautiful," Callum said softly. "Kind of feels like us, doesn't it?" Lydia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Yeah, it does. It's weird, though. I didn't think we'd get here. Not so soon." "Neither did I," Callum admitted, sipping his coffee. "But we did, and that's what matters." The weeks following the confrontation had been a whirlwind of change. Odette had moved out, her apologies and pleas for reconciliation falling on deaf ears. Callum had made it clear that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, and while he wished her well for Lydia's sake, he couldn't allow her back into his life. The business had also stabilized. With Galen gone, Debbie Gleon had stepped up, proving herself to be a capable leader. The team had rallied behind Callum, their loyalty cemented by his transparency and determination to rebuild. The company was thriving again, and for the first time in months, Callum felt like he could breathe. But the most profound change had been in his relationship with Lydia. The ordeal had brought them closer in ways Callum hadn't anticipated. They had always been close, but now there was a depth to their bond, a shared understanding of pain, resilience, and growth. "Dad," Lydia said suddenly, pulling him from his thoughts, "do you ever think about what's next, like now that everything's settled?" Callum considered her question, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "I think about it all the time," he admitted, "and I don't have all the answers yet. But I know one thing for sure. Whatever's next, we face it together." She smiled, her eyes bright with a mixture of relief and hope. "I like that plan." The sound of the doorbell interrupted their conversation. Lydia glanced toward the house. "I'll get it," she said, standing and heading inside. Callum leaned back on the swing, the warmth of the sun on his face. He closed his eyes, savoring the peace that had eluded him for so long. It wasn't perfect. There were still wounds to heal, questions that lingered, but it was enough. A few minutes later, Lydia returned, a large envelope in her hands. "This came for you," she said, handing it over. Callum opened it, pulling out a stack of papers. His breath caught as he read the letter at the top. Finalized divorce decree. He sat there for a moment, staring at the words. It was over. Officially, legally, over. "Dad?" Lydia's voice was soft, hesitant. "Are you okay?" He looked up at her, a smile breaking across his face. "I'm more than okay," he said, his voice steady. "I'm free." She sat beside him again, resting her head on his shoulder. "So, what now?" Callum wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. "Now we keep moving forward, one day at a time." As they sat together on the porch swing, the phoenix rising in Lydia's sketchbook seemed to come alive, a symbol of their rebirth. They weren't the same people they had been before the storm, but that was okay. They were stronger now, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt bright. What do you think of Callum Waverly and his journey through betrayal and resilience? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to stay updated with all our stories. And be sure to check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen. Thank you for watching.